Good. Okay. So now you're all being recorded. So now no one's going to talk now, knowing that they're being recorded. So what happens in England, just to make kind of a long story short, and I could make it longer, but I don't think you asked for that. You have Parliament and the king agreeing how they're going to get along. You have the king who is, or queen, remember, Parliament summons a new queen to come in and take power and agree to Parliament stipulations, and she and her husband, anyone remember their names? Yes, Matt.
Was it William and Mary?
It was William and Mary, yes. There's a college in Virginia named for them. And it could very well be you chose to come here rather than William and Mary because you didn't want to have to learn about members of the British royal family. So William and Mary come over, become king and queen. And then the next monarch is Queen Anne. And she is another daughter of James II. James II is the king that Parliament fired. So he goes off to live in France. But then his daughters come to become monarchs successively. And there is a problem when Queen Anne dies, and the problem is this. Does anyone know what the problem might have been? Aside from sad for Queen Anne that she died and can no longer be queen. Yes, Giovanni.
Was it that she had no heirs?
That's true. She had no heirs. Okay, so it would have been relatively easy if Queen Anne did have a son or a daughter who then could have become the monarch, but she doesn't. And the other problem is the English Bill of Rights from 1689, in which William and Mary agreed, these are the rules, Parliament sets them. One of the rules is no Catholic can be the king or queen, which means now we've decided, that is, we being the folks who decide these things in England, we want to have a king or queen. King or queen has to be part of this royal family, which is connected with the whole, Charles I, Charles II, James II, etc., the Stuarts as they're known. And so it has to be that connection. We can't just pick someone out of thin air and say, okay, now this person is the king. There has to be a certain legitimacy to this position, okay? And one of the stipulations now is you have to be both part of that family and not a Catholic. And among those who are in line for the throne, that is in the line of succession, there are about 48 people who are directly in line, but are all Catholic. So in order to get a Protestant, we have to go down to number 49 on the list, who happens to be a prince off in Germany. Remember, you're a member of the royal family, you can't marry a brother or sister. In Hawaii, the royal family in Hawaii does this, but not in Europe. And so you are married to a royal family somewhere else, which means there could be someone in line to the throne who is a prince in Germany, or the current English monarch's late husband was actually from Greece by way of Germany. So, you don't have all the people in line hanging around England. You have to go off to Germany in this case. And the person in line is the Elector of Hanover. Hanover is a principality in Germany, and the Elector is the prince. And the Elector is an amiable fellow named, anyone know who the Elector of Hanover was in 1714 when all of this is happening? Julia is shaking her head like she doesn't even want to know who that is. Of what use would it be to me to know the name of the Elector of Hanover in 1714? Actually, at first it was an electress, as a woman, and everyone thought, okay, she's going to be the next queen. Then wouldn't you know it, she dies. So her son becomes, this is why Julia was shaking her head. She was really holding out for Louisa, who was going to be the Queen of England. She dies, and instead her son George becomes the king. And George comes off to England to become the King of England. He is also the Elector of Hanover. And George is German, as I think I've indicated. And to him, being in England is really kind of disappointing. He never even learns the language, but he spends about as much time in Germany as he does in England. Now, with this of course gives Parliament more to do because the king doesn't really want to be bothered much with what's happening. Now, typically the king doesn't do a lot of the work himself or herself, if it's a queen, of running things, because they kind of had trouble with a king wanting to run things back in the 1600s, and they decided that's not a good idea. We want Parliament to run things, but executive functions are handled by the king, but not the king directly. Instead, the king appoints ministers to do these things. And usually the ministers are members of the aristocracy, people who can, get along with the king and then go tell Parliament this is what the king needs. And usually the most important of the ministers is the guy they call the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And that's the person in charge of money. Because remember, that's the big thing the king needs or the queen needs. So the Chancellor of the Exchequer, most important of the king's ministers. And George the First, we didn't call him George the First at the time because we didn't know there would be more than one, is not really that much interested in the details of administration. And then his son, George the Second, becomes king, and he is also as much attached to Germany as he is to England. I should say George the Second, and now I am getting kind of off the subject of the Constitution, I apologize. George II was responsible for trying to bring a more elevated culture to England. So he's responsible for bringing George Frederick Handel to England. And he's the reason there is a water music suite and a series, a choral piece you'll probably hear a great deal of in during the Christmas season, the Messiah. Okay, it's in it, the libretto's in English, even though here's a German composer, but he's working in London. So you have that. And so this could be on the test, by the way. What did George II bring to England? And there are two things. One is George Frederick Handel. The other is this. He realizes that the way things have worked is, I tell my Chancellor of the Exchequer what it is I want. He then has to go to Parliament and convince them of what it is that he wants. Wouldn't it make a lot more sense to have your Chancellor of the Exchequer, someone who is in Parliament and can get things done? And so what happens under George II, not because he had studied political theory or had, read a book on how to get things done in Parliament, just as a matter of pragmatic how to get things done, he appointed as his first minister a guy named Robert Walpole. And the advantage of Robert Walpole was he controlled a majority in Parliament. Thus, he's someone who can get things done. And Robert Walpole is the first person to hold an office that we now call what? I used to do this the other way around. I used to say, here is the office, who was the first person to hold it? And there would be all kinds of wild guesses. There's a town in southeastern Massachusetts named for Mr. Walpole because he was a very important political figure and very important as Massachusetts was part of the empire. And Walpole was a guy who could get things done through Parliament because he controlled a majority in Parliament. And what was the name of his office? Yes, Trevor and James. Is it a tag team?
Yeah, we agreed it was the prime minister.
It is the prime minister. Thank you. Yes. So Robert Walpole, first prime minister, and things work pretty swimmingly with the king being able to either go off to Germany or be on a barge on the Thames listening to water music suite while Robert Walpole is muscling things through Parliament, and things go along swimmingly, except of course for the obvious thing that's going to happen, which is that some people in Parliament don't like Walpole and thus become the opposition party. That's all a story for another day. The question I have then is, well, while all of this is going on in England, what's happening in the American colonies? And that's a different story. You have in the American colonies essentially these Each colony created by a different group of investors for different purposes. So, for example, the London Company in 1607 tries to launch a colony in Virginia. And they have a charter given to them by the crown to start this colonial enterprise. And they're going to export stuff to England, like furs and gold and the other things they're hoping to find in Virginia. And they are governed the same way any corporation then or now would be governed. This is at a time when we're creating the whole idea of a corporation. That is, people, investors, buy shares in a company, then they choose a board of directors for the company, often called a board of governors. The board of governors chooses a chief executive officer, and the company works. By the way, what's usually the function of a corporate body like this? Say the London Company going off to get gold and stuff in Virginia. Does anyone here invested in a company? Anyone here own any stock? Some people do. Jovan, you do. Paul does. And what do you hope to get out of your stock? Haley does. Okay. Trevor and James. By the way, we're not singling you out now as the 1% who own stock. It's good. Yes, Jovan, what do you hope to get when you invest?
If you're a shareholder, you hope to get profit effectively.
Yeah,
you hope
to get a
company
profit.
does well, so you make money.
You want to get a return on your investment. Exactly. Yes. So that's what the others are nodding, not saying, no, that's not what I wanted. I wanted something different. Yeah. And so your board of directors work for the shareholders to try to get a profit. And it doesn't really work in Virginia. They can't really find a profit. And one thing that happens is there's a big disconnect between the shareholders sitting off in London. This is in like 16 to 16 teens, and the people who are in Virginia. The shareholders want a profit. People in Virginia, and by the way, Virginia is, for most respects, a death trap. Over the first 17 or so years of the settlement, something like 5,000 people go from England to the Virginia colony. And in 1625, the population is about 1,300. So, do the math. You have 5,000 people go, and by 1625, only 1,300 of them are still alive because it's a death trap. Okay, so that's one thing that happens, big disconnect. And the other thing is this: there is a realization that, you have sent over a governor to make sure that people are doing what they can to find the gold that we know is there. Doesn't really work. And so you think, well, maybe if we give the people there some kind of a voice in what's happening, or have them come to us for advice. So in Virginia in 1619, they allow some of the landowners to come and give advice to the governor in what's called a House of Burgesses. So this is not the governing structure of the colony. The government still is in the hands of the shareholders in London, and will be until 1625, when the king says this whole thing has been mismanaged and he takes it over, which means he then assumes both the possibilities and the problems for this colony, and doesn't say, yeah, okay, the House of Burgesses, that's a great idea, keep doing that. No, he says, no, the governor runs things. And so that's one thing happening in Virginia. But the thing to remember here, each of these colonial ventures is started as a joint stock company. And the big change comes with New England. I'm doing this in kind of a long-winded, roundabout way. Ultimately, we will get to what's really important here, I hope. At least that's my plan. Meanwhile, does anyone have any questions? Okay. Well, in New England, well, actually, we'll back up a minute. In the 1620s, two different colonial ventures set out from Europe, from the English-speaking world to New England. And one goes to Plymouth. And these are folks, just for the sake of simplicity, we'll call the Pilgrims. And there are about 100 or so folks in this little expedition. What's the name of the boat they come on? Yes, Paul.
The Mayflower.
The Mayflower. They come over on the Mayflower. And they had been given permission to go settle in the northern part of Virginia. And most of these people are part of a particular religious sect. They had left England initially because they were getting arrested in England for being dissenters. I mentioned this big fight going on between the Catholics and the Protestants in England. There's also a fight going on among the Protestants between the Church of England and those who don't want to subscribe to the Church of England because they think it's too close to the Catholic Church and what they want. We don't need to get into all of the theology here. They want to get right with God by having their entire community based on the scripture. Okay, that's kind of what they're up to. And that's illegal to do in England. In England, you're required to belong to the Church of England, go to Church of England services. You can't have your own prayer services at home. And the king is the head of the Church of England, and the king doesn't want anyone not being part of the Church of England. And if you were the king, you would certainly agree. So these folks are either thrown in jail or banished, and a number of them had gone off to Holland in the early part of the century and were, over in Holland, didn't really speak the language, and the Dutch weren't really acting the way Pilgrims. They didn't call themselves Pilgrims all the time, thought people should act. In fact, they thought anyone could believe whatever they want. And their children were growing up, speaking Dutch and being more enamored of the flesh pots of Amsterdam than of the purity of their souls. So anyway, they want to go to start their colony somewhere else, which of course, if they went to a company in England and say, can you send us over so we can worship God in our own way? Or if they went to the king and said that, not going to get a very good response. They do find some investors who are somewhat sympathetic to them and say, okay, we'll send you over to settle the northern part of Virginia. And here's the deal. You work for us for 7 years. And at the end of 7 years, if you've paid us back, everything you own belongs to you. If you haven't paid us back, everything you own belongs to us. Of course, what choice do these folks have? They agree to this and they set off on the Mayflower. And in November of 1620, they arrive in, anyone know where they arrive? Yes, Jovan.
Plymouth?
Actually, no, not Plymouth. They arrive in Provincetown. Trick question. Tip of Cape Cod, and it's November. They've been supposed to be going to Virginia. There are about 100 folks in this expedition. Some of them are these deeply devout folks, and others are folks who signed on, or they're servants, or they think, we should go there and see what happens, and maybe we'll find gold the way everyone else is finding gold in the New World. And they reach the tip of Cape Cod. And I have to say, my understanding is the leaders of this particular enterprise did not want to go to Virginia, because in Virginia, they would be under the control of the London Company. They really wanted to break off on their own. Let me just see if I can find something here on my shelf that'll be useful to us. Okay. So here they are on Cape Cod in November of 1620. And they didn't want to go to Virginia. On the other hand, these other folks who had signed on, and the one thing they learned about Virginia was it was really hot. It was a miserable climate. I don't know if any of you have spent time on the tip of Cape Cod or pretty much anywhere in New England in November. It's usually not very hot. In fact, it's usually pretty unpleasant. And it was this bleak wilderness. Suddenly there they are. And some members of this group are saying, hey, why don't we go to Virginia? Others are saying, well, why don't we just go somewhere else? And so there is a fear that this whole thing is going to fall apart and there won't be enough of these pilgrims to sustain whatever they do. So the leaders of the Pilgrims get together with others of the party. There are about 100 or so folks here, and they agree to form their own colony. So they do something that I wasn't planning to spend much time talking about this, but it's worth reflecting on. Remember, they had been, paid by this Council for New England to go off and settle, and the Council for New England just wants a return on their investment. Doesn't really matter to them if these folks, and they know, by the way, these are hardworking, industrious people. They're probably not going to fall apart the way the Jamestown colony has. These folks are going to get to work to plant things and so on. So, and then anything they do, it's unlikely they will be able to return our investment in 7 years. So anything they do will belong to us. For us investors, it's a win-win. For them, it's a very big lose-lose because A, they've gone off to the new world, and then B, they've worked for 7 years and they don't own anything at the end of it. So that's kind of the way we savvy investors are looking at this. I'm thinking we actually should form some kind of a game to play what happens in Plymouth. But anyway, these guys get together and they draw up a compact or agreement. And it goes like this: in the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord, King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, Ireland, King, defender of the faith, etc., having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern part of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends foresaid. And by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof, we have hereunder subscribed our names at Cape Cod, the 11th of November, in the year of the reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland, the 18th, and Scotland, the 54th, Anno Domino 1620. So what does this mean? This agreement? Yes, Matt.
So basically, this agreement, the compact, is the Pilgrims and Puritans coming together to form a way of governing themselves in this colony in North America.
Exactly. So it's this group saying, we all sign this. We all agree then we will make such laws, offices, etc., as we need from time to time, and we'll all obey them. No one had said in England, hey, when you get there, you're going to have to start a government. They take this up by themselves. A guy named John Carver had been appointed to be the governor off in England by the shareholders. Carver dies in April of 1621, and then this group in Plymouth chooses William Bradford to be the governor. And so they have agreed to form their own government. This is something that hadn't happened before in the English-speaking world, at least since the creation of the office of king. You have a government that's in place, but here's a group deciding this is the kind of government we're going to create. So this is, and then they are going to govern themselves. We're not going to talk too much about how they do that, but they get along pretty much with themselves. They do make laws, offices, and so on. And then in about 1630, another group comes to the relatively same area. These are the folks who come to Boston, the people we'll call Puritans. Now, there are differences between the Pilgrims and the Puritans. We don't need to get into them here. My eyes start to glaze over as I try to explain the differences to them. But if you're interested, I can go into this, but probably not now. Now, with the Puritans, there's something a little bit different. Now, by the way, does the king get upset with Plymouth because they're doing all of this stuff? They're making this compact? Well, no, because the king really doesn't care about Plymouth. Nothing really is happening here. These people are just kind of in the very fringes of the empire, and they are people who pretty much mind their own business, don't bother anyone. They even get along pretty well with the Indians. So that's not the king's concern. The king is concerned with Virginia, and the king's going to be increasingly concerned with the West Indies. The king has other things on his mind. It's always hard for us in Massachusetts to recognize the fact that people in the rest of the country, even the rest of the world, have things on their mind other than us. We have this presumption that everyone is watching us and it really cares what we're doing. When this doesn't look like a group that thinks that. So happy to say people don't really care that much about what we are doing. We should care what we're doing. But anyway, the next people we'll talk about are the ones that Matt introduced as the Puritans, and I've spoken a little bit about the Puritans, another of these religious groups, and they have been watching very closely, not so much what's happening in the New World as what's happening in England. And in England in the 1620s, the Puritans are within the Church of England. They are part of the church, and they really want to get right with God. And they see that the Church of England, they think, has adopted too many of the practices of the Roman Catholic Church, and they're really not happy with that. So what do? Well, they want to change the rituals of the church. They want to have, don't want to have the music, the incense, the candles, the artwork, the other things. All of that is a distraction. And like the Pilgrims, they want to focus not only their worship, but their lives around the scripture. And they see that the church is an institution that's grown up not in keeping with the scripture. And they're able to get away with this in the 16 teens, but then in the 1620s, new Archbishop of Canterbury, and he's the leader of the Church of England, he's the one appointed by the king, starts cracking down on these people, thinks they're a bunch of cranks. By the way, the term Puritan itself is given to mock these folks. They want to purify everything, do away with the candles, incense, etc. So the people who don't like them call them Puritans. And a 20th century critic said that a Puritan is someone who has a sneaking suspicion that someone somewhere is having a good time, which may be unfair to the Puritans. But anyway, these folks want to get out of England. And the king isn't going to say, yeah, why don't you go somewhere else? They have to be very careful of because they're not going to say, hey, we want to go somewhere else because we can't stand you and the way you're leading the church to hell. You're leading us all into damnation. They have to be a little careful of this. Some of their investors are also Puritans, and they form a company, the Massachusetts Bay Company. And under the guise of setting up a trading company between the Neponset River, between the Charles River and the Merrimack River, they are going to go off and trade. And so in the late 1620s, they get a charter from the king. It's now King Charles I, and he grants them permission to go off and trade in this area. And they set up a corporate structure for this enterprise, much like the corporate structure of the London Company. That is, investors will buy into this and then will appoint a board of directors, essentially, and a governor to manage this enterprise. And they go off in the summer of 1630. And there are a couple of differences in this enterprise and the Pilgrim enterprise and in the Virginia enterprise. One big difference is this: a corporation will have an annual meeting to choose officers, etc. And typically the charter says where the annual meeting happens. The Massachusetts Bay Charter doesn't say where the annual meeting is going to take place. Okay, that's one difference, and you may think that doesn't make a whole big difference to you, but it's going to have great significance. Secondly, in 1625, as I mentioned, the king had decided he would take away the charter of the London Company so he would run Virginia. Now, to take away the charter, the king has to go to court and argue in court that the company has violated the charter. Therefore, they have to surrender the charter, which is an official document, and it has a seal on it. And so you have the charter, you have the power to do what the charter says. So in order to get the charter of the Virginia Company, the king has to go to court, which he does, and he wins in court, and the charter is surrendered. The king now holds it. The governor of the Massachusetts Bay Company, John Winthrop, who is a lawyer, very good lawyer, not only does he leave out where the annual meeting is going to take place, but when he sails in the summer of 1630, he takes the charter with him. So if the king finds out what they're doing, he's going to have to go to America and get the charter. He can't simply have some lawyer in London surrender it. So they arrive in Massachusetts in 1630, and they have a meeting of shareholders at what is today Cambridge. It then was called Newtown, and it was midway between 2 points of the settlement, Charlestown and Watertown. And Winthrop has invited not only all the shareholders, and remember, there are shareholders off in England, but also freemen who have come. Now, there are servants who had come over with this expedition. That is, they had been bound to service to someone, but these are the freemen. They might not be shareholders, but at this first meeting, Winthrop announces this is a meeting of the general court. Typically, the shareholders would meet in a general court, and it's open to all freemen. And what will happen is the freemen in the general court will then appoint the deputies as well as the governor. And this is all in accordance with the structure set forth in the charter, that there will be a general court every year of the shareholders who will choose the deputies and magistrates to kind of administer the company. But now Winthrop opens it up to all freemen, and the general court becomes something other than a group of shareholders. It's all the freemen, because Winthrop wants to hold this group together, and they're the ones who will choose the governor. So what you see happening in 1630 is a change from this corporate structure, which would govern the company, to a structure governing what they will now call their province of Massachusetts Bay. Now, Charles I isn't really looking at what's happening in Massachusetts. He has other things on his mind. We mentioned Parliament cutting off his head, which to him is a lot more important than what's happening in Massachusetts. What you see happening here, though, is Massachusetts becoming a self-governing entity. And you see a similar thing happening in other colonies. A group of dissidents leave Massachusetts and go to Rhode Island. They get a charter in the 1630s and also set up a government. Similarly, Connecticut gets a charter. And then this is what's happening in the first part of the 1600s. Then, as I think you all know, Charles I gets into this fight with Parliament, loses his head. And for about 20 years, no one in England is really worried about North America. They're worried about what's happening in England. And then Charles II comes back. And by that time, these colonial enterprises have been governing themselves for a while. And Charles II does some really smart things, as I think someone has said he was really smart. He wants to give away land in these colonies to some of his supporters, people who had supported him against the Cromwell and Parliament. And so he does give grants in Maryland to a group of Catholics who start a colony there. And again, they have a charter and they can go settle in Maryland. And the Carolinas, named actually the first charter of South Carolina, is a bit different because there, the first people to settle in South Carolina came from Barbados and Jamaica rather than England. Those were other colonies started by the British. By the 1640s, they were producing sugar and using enslaved labor, mainly from West Africa, as they're competing with the Spanish in growing sugar in the West Indies. And by the 1670s, they're running out of land in Jamaica and Barbados, and they see South Carolina as a place where they can set up shop. And so the first charter of South Carolina sets up that the government will be in the hands of these large landowners who have essentially bought the colony. And the charter is actually written by John Locke, who is the secretary to the first proprietor of South Carolina, and it sets power in the hands of these shareholders to govern the colony. And by this time, with the king distracted, the House of Burgesses in Virginia has emerged as a real governing force, even though the king is going to send over governors who will be or won't be listened to. And here in New England, you have assemblies set up which govern the colony, and then the governor they choose. And sometimes they re-elect him and sometimes they don't. New York had been a Dutch colony until the 1660s. And then in 1660, the King Charles II gives it to his brother, the Duke of York, hence it becomes New York. And here it's governed by large landowners who have the real power, and the Duke of York appoints a proprietor, a governor. The Duke of York becomes King James II in the 1680s. So you see is these different colonies emerging, each with a somewhat different government, for the most part, really modeled on these corporate structures, but with greater or lesser degrees of power in the hands of the landowners in the some of the colonies like Virginia or South Carolina, or the freemen in the case of Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, initially, the freemen all met together in the general court with the deputies, but then they get into an argument in the late 1630s, believe it or not, over a pig that belonged to a widow, and she lost her pig, and it's a big hog, and poor widow, doesn't have a lot of resources, but she did have this big hog that wandered off. She never saw it again. Now, a year or so later, she says that she thinks she knows what happened to the big hog. By the way, has anyone heard this story and know what happened to the big hog? I thought I saw Trevor nodding his head saying, ah, yes, we're out to the story of the widow Brown and her hog. Okay, it turned out that the wealthiest guy in Massachusetts was a fellow named Robert Kane, and he was a merchant. And he was the founder of the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company. And the widow accused him of taking and butchering her hog. And the general court sits not only as a lawmaking body, and for the most part, it doesn't have to make many laws. In 1642, it did come up with a general body of liberties, a code of laws. And they sit as a court, and the deputies in this case think that the widow is right. She really, this rich guy really pulled a fast one, got her hog and butchered it. The magistrates, on the other hand, think that Robert Kane is actually right here, and they can't agree. There are more magistrates than there are deputies, and so they outvote them. But then the deputies say, well, wait a minute, we're not going to sit in the same house with you because you keep outvoting us, so we will never sit together again. So what happens is in Massachusetts, you create a legislative body that has two houses because they couldn't agree. The magistrates, the somewhat lower house, the deputies who are somewhat higher, that is, they're the ones who are supposed to advise the governor. They had been meeting together quite happily until the whole hog issue came up, and then they stop. And so you have in these colonies, these systems of government emerging really out of experience. Okay, so by the end of the century, you have each of these colonies pretty much governing itself with the system that had emerged out of a corporate charter. Now, there's another thing that happens here, and this involves our friend James II. We know he was fired by Parliament, and before he was, though, James II is looking at a map of North America, and he realizes that you have all of these little colonies here. In New England at this time, there was a group of folks in New Hampshire, along the coast of New Hampshire, who said they governed themselves. They were their own colony. And then there's settlements up on the coast of Maine, always being attacked by the native people up there, by the Abenakis. And then there's Massachusetts Bay. And then there is Plymouth. And then there are settlements out on the Connecticut River that, well, Massachusetts says they're part of Massachusetts, but New York also claims up to the Connecticut River. And so there's that problem. And then you go down the Connecticut River, and there is a pretty big colony at Hartford. And then on Long Island Sound, there is another colony at New Haven, and they're not connected. And then if you go to the east, there is a pretty big colony at Providence, started by Roger Williams. And then there is a colony at Newport, which is a trading town. And then you go east of that, and there's the Plymouth colony, which stretches to Cape Cod. And then on Long Island itself, you have some of these towns had been started by people from Connecticut. Some had been started by people from Massachusetts, and then others were started by people from New York. And in fact, the islands of, if you've ever wondered, if you realize that, does anyone know what county Nantucket is in? Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard are in? There's a question I know you weren't expecting today. The counties of Massachusetts. You didn't know you were supposed to know that. Yes, Trevor.
Is it Brewster?
No. Yes, Haley.
This is a guess. Is it called Dukes?
It is called Dukes. That's a very good guess. And it would be unfair then to ask why you think it's called Dukes. Well, does anyone know what are, well, okay, I'm not going to continue this guessing game. On Long Island, there is Queens County, and there's also Kings County, and thus Dukes County makes sense. These were all part of New York. Okay, so Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, part of New York. Okay, they're off the coast of the Plymouth colony, though, and you have all kind of trade going on between them and Plymouth, as well as Rhode Island. And then you go a little further west from New York. And by the way, there's Kings County is also another county in metropolitan New York. I believe that's where Staten Island is, in Kings County. So you have King, Queen, Duke, these three islands. Okay. And then you go a little further west. Newark in New Jersey had been settled by Puritans from New England. And New Jersey essentially had two different colonial governments, one in what then was called East Jersey, centered around Perth Amboy, and then the other in West Jersey around Burlington. And, the western part was kind of more in the satellite of Philadelphia. Philadelphia started in the 1670s and begins really prospering. That was a huge tract of land given by King Charles II to William Penn, a Quaker. Anyway, this is a relatively small area in which you have, I don't know if anyone's keeping track of how many different colonies you have in this area. And here is the problem. You go north to the St. Lawrence River, and the French are now starting to send more people off to New France. And they're trading with the Indians, and their Indian allies are raiding into these New England colonies. And anytime there's going to be a war between the English and the French, you're going to see a war fought between New France. And by the way, what's the general term for this geographic area where all of these little colonies like Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Plymouth, Connecticut, Rhode Island are? Yes, Paul.
New England.
It is New England. So New England and New France are the front line in this war between the English and the French. And so King James II knows if there is a war here with the French, you're going to have to get all these little colonies together. They'll all have to raise their militia forces and do something to repel the invaders. Wouldn't it make more sense to put them all together in one colony, one enterprise? So in 16, and that's one thing he wants to do. And the second thing is, he sent over a guy to look into how things were going here. And this guy was really shocked. There's a fellow named Randolph, comes off to the New England colonies in the 1670s. And wow, the English flag at this time had the cross of St. George on it. Now, here in Boston, they thought having a cross was a symbol of idolatry, and they really didn't like it. So when someone insisted we have to fly the English flag, they would cut the cross out of it. Also, there is no Church of England allowed to practice here in Massachusetts. And also, think about this. This guy Randolph comes off here knowing, okay, so the Massachusetts Bay Company set up shop back in the 1630s here. He finds out the Massachusetts Bay Company now acts as though it runs the place. And in fact, they've all passed all these laws, including laws that punish people for things that aren't crimes in England. Like, one thing is blasphemy. You can be executed for blasphemy here. There are all kinds of, some things are still crimes in England, like adultery. But if you venture in front of the State House, you'll see a statue of a woman named Mary Dyer, who was executed in 1660. Does anyone know why the Massachusetts authorities hanged Mary Dyer? Isn't it odd that we put up statues in front of the State House of people that get hanged? Yes, Matt.
She was preaching a different form of Christianity than the colony leaders were allowing. And after a few attempts to exile her, she came back and continued, and that's when she was captured and hung.
So do you know what was the particular form of Christianity she was preaching?
I don't remember the exact name off the top of my head.
Does anyone? She's a Quaker. Okay, so she's a Quaker. What religious tradition did William Penn follow? Does anyone know? Yes, Paul.
He was also a Quaker.
He's also a Quaker. So think about that. You think if Mary Dyer had gone to England instead of Massachusetts, it would be Dyervania, that the king grants this huge tract of land to a Quaker. Massachusetts hangs a Quaker. So this is crazy, Randolph says. And also, each town has its common, that is, they set apart common land. And he wants to know what gives them the power to do that. Doesn't all land belong to the king? And by the way, how did they get this land? Actually, if you go to the Massachusetts archives, you'll see that in the 1670s and early 80s, there's a real flurry of activity as these folks who have set up towns in Massachusetts go to find Indians that they then can buy the land from. So they have a title to the land. They bought it from the Indians. They didn't just show up here and take the land, because otherwise Randolph will say, hey, you know what? All this land belongs to the king. When someone up in one of the towns in Newburyport says, well, wait a minute, what about our rights? Here, Randolph is showing up. We're going to divide up all of this land that we've been owning. The common land is all going to be sold. What about our rights? And one of the folks that the king sends over says, you have no more rights than not to be sold as slaves. So don't whine up to us about your rights. And so anyway, what King James II sees how badly Massachusetts Bay has overstepped its authority and says, we're going to suspend the charter because of all of this malfeasance, hanging Quakers, having other laws punishing people. What corporation has the power to to execute someone? And, cutting the cross out of the flag is kind of an insignificant thing next to all these other things. So we're going to suspend their charter, take away the charters from all of the other New England colonies. And instead of having all these dinky little colonies, we will create a Dominion of New England. They'll all be together in one big colony, and we will have a governor sent by the crown to govern the whole thing, and he will appoint people to be his advisors. No more of this. You elect your legislature, and they decide what's what. You'll have a governor appointing things, and the governor is actually going to be headquartered in New York. There'll be a deputy governor in Boston. So this is kind of what's going on here. The English crown trying to assert its power over here and make some sense out of this welter of colonies. And folks here are not really happy about it. And what happens here, it's simultaneous with James II being overthrown. There's an uprising in Boston. And after this, after the overthrow of James II, the crown, King William does grant a new charter to Massachusetts Bay, pretty much the same as the old charter, except now the king appoints the governor. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same. Connecticut combined into 2 colonies. Rhode Island is 1 colony. Massachusetts Bay also gets Plymouth as well as Maine. There is a New Hampshire colony. So what you have after this is a period of about 60 years where we have relative peace between England and the colonies, and the colonial governments really emerge with a governor appointed by the monarch, the assemblies chosen by the towns, or some variation of local control of the assemblies. In Virginia and in New York, the assemblies continue to be really bodies consisting of the big landowners. Massachusetts, it's really people from the towns, as in Rhode Island and Connecticut. And South Carolina also, there's real power in the hands of the landowners, with a governor appointed either by the crown or by the proprietor. Pennsylvania is a colony where the proprietor appoints the governor. New York also is a proprietor. Maryland a proprietor. The others, it's the king, except in New England, in Connecticut and Rhode Island, where it is the assembly that chooses the governor. Connecticut and Rhode Island had pretty much gone along with things, so they get to keep their governor chosen by themselves. So you have that system emerging. And what happens is you have the assembly representing the localities. I don't want to use the term the people because that's kind of an amorphous thing. The governor, for the most part, represents the interests of the British crown or the proprietors. And sometimes they get along and sometimes they don't. Some governors are more adept than others. It's pretty safe to say that very few of these colonial governors look at being, say, governor of Massachusetts or governor of New Jersey as the summit of their ambition. Often they are either military officers or British officials who are really hoping to use this position to get a better position. But for the most part, the British government is not paying strict attention to what's going on here. So you have colonial systems emerging out of a kind of just experience. So, any questions on this? I fear I've just thrown a lot of, yes, V.
I had a question. Since how you were talking about the Quakers and the Puritans and the Catholics and the Protestants, when did the Episcopalians arrive? And when you was talking about part of the French, didn't majority of the French, when they came down from Nova Scotia to come to the New England areas?
That's two very good questions. First, the Anglicans in America become Episcopalians after the Revolution. It's still the Church of England. And in Virginia is dominated by the Anglicans. I mean, it is the official Church of England. Okay, they become the Episcopalians after the Revolution because, some of the Anglicans leave, others stay. At King's Chapel here in Boston, they changed the prayer, so they're no longer praying for the royal family and so on. Other than that, that's a big story. Now, with the French, you're still talking later on. There are going to be French coming down. At the time, Nova Scotia is an area in contest. That is, the French claimed it, but so did the British, which is why Nova Scotia, they have Scottish attempts to settle Scots there in the early 1700s. And between 1692 and 1763, the British and the French are almost constantly at war. And that's an important part of the story because each of these colonies is very much British, and they are supporting the British war effort. And also a lot of the wars being fought here. I mean, New England is always on this front line. And so Nova Scotia goes back and forth between the British and the French over the 1700s. So it's Nova Scotia, then the French take it, they call it Acadia, and then the British take it back and they expel all the Acadians and divide up the land among New Englanders, and they actually send the Acadians down. Some of them go to Massachusetts, others go to Louisiana. And so you have that big story. In fact, over at Lewisburg Square in Boston commemorates the siege of Lewisburg in Cape Breton in 1745. And there is the Lewisburg Cross that was taken from a Catholic church up there. And if you go to Old North Church, there are 4 angels that were being sent by a French ship to Nova Scotia, and it's captured by a British privateer who happened to belong to the Old North congregation. Old North was an Anglican church. In 1688, as part of that whole problem with the Dominion of New England, you do have the establishment of King's Chapel, and then others become Anglicans here in Boston. So you have Trinity Church and Old North, or Christ Church, being started at the same time. So one of the other things to remember here, and you did a good job of pointing this out, there are all of these different religious denominations here fighting it out. And there's something of a change in the 1740s with a Great Awakening, but then we'll get into this religious conflict later on. So any other questions on this kind of whole mess of stuff that I just dumped on you pertaining to colonial constitutions and how the colonies are governed and where they fit in with the British Empire? Okay, now before I forget, because we'll get to the end of the class and I will have forgotten, on Wednesday, we're going to do our first discussion of documents, and we have David Hume's That Politics May Be Reduced to a Science and Montesquieu. And I sent out an email to 4 lucky people who were chosen to lead the discussion. If you got the email and you didn't respond, I'll just take it that you got it. If you didn't get the email and you wondered, boy, didn't I win that particular lottery? Let me know. I know I have written down in my other office who were the chosen, who is called, and who was chosen. So that's what we'll be doing on Wednesday. Next Monday is Constitution Day, and we have as our assignment the handing out of constitutions. So let me know if you are able to be part of that, and you will if you take part in handing out constitutions. What I will do is give you credit for an additional quiz that you would have taken but didn't. I mean, that could mean, okay, you miss a quiz and still you get credit for it, or you take all the quizzes and you get an extra A on a quiz for handing out constitutions and doing your civic duty by educating others. Okay, so what does all this mean? I mean, I just feel like I've just given you a lot of, well, I should ask you, what do you think all this means? I've just spent an hour gassing on about things that are of great interest to me. I'm not quite sure how interesting they are to anyone else. Fortunately, I have a captive audience here twice a week that will patiently listen. Yes, V, looks like you're about to say something.
Well, some of it, what you said we're going to get to later, it's interesting to me because we're going to be actually talking about my ancestors that I just recently found out that were on my father's side from Nova Scotia,
really?
Maine, and all of that. And the freed slaves, they were tricked into coming to the New England to fight in the Revolutionary War for promise of land. And New England promised them the same thing. You come on our side, you fight against the French, and we'll give you land for you to farm for free in Nova Scotia. And there was a back and forth and
Oh, wow.
everything. So yeah, it was eye-opening to finally find out what part of me belongs somewhere. Whereas instead of just going through life as old as I am and not
Wow.
knowing where I come from. And so that part, because all my ancestors unfortunately are dead.
Oh,
And yeah, so we never learned about that.
wow.
But yeah, Nova
That's
Scotia
interesting.
and all that is my dad's side, and big history back there
That's interesting.
to
Yeah.
America from
Yeah.
Maine, because we used to go to Maine all the time.
Uh-huh.
Never knew why everybody settled the way they did.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks. Good. Paul, you have your hand up?
Yeah, so I think the reason that you're talking about this is because a lot of this is the fundamentals and the bedrock that we're going to base for creating the Constitution. Specifically, I know the Mayflower Compact is like one of the first governing documents that was created for the US. So that is imperative that we talk about so that we can build to the final governing document, which is the Constitution. So I think that's why you're
That's
having this
another good point, because here they are really creating these ideas of government, and it's not that they're not reading political theory. They are doing this through experience and what works. V, you have your hand up again? Okay. Okay, so that's what we will be talking about. Now, just one thing to remember as you are reading Montesquieu, he talks about systems of government. I don't want to give away for those who are going to be delving into Montesquieu, telling us all about him next time. Montesquieu is a French guy, and he looks around the world at how different systems are structured. And he sees essentially that there are three different kinds of governments. There are tyrannies. And by the way, he's not using this in a pejorative way. He's just trying to make sense of how different systems work. There are tyrannies, and then there are aristocracies, and then there are what he calls democracies. And each one has a different governing principle. The tyranny operates through fear, the aristocracy through honor, and the democracy through virtue. And he also believes that a tyranny will work over a big area because everyone's afraid of the tyrant. He can get things done. Aristocracy can work over a somewhat bigger area. You have these nobles who have a principality somewhere like Germany or Japan. He doesn't use Japan as an example. By the way, his examples of tyranny were China and the Ottoman Empire. And if you know much about how China worked or the Ottoman Empire worked, you'll know that he really didn't know how those two systems work, but he was kind of imagining it the way he's an educated Frenchman. Okay. Aristocracies, somewhat bigger area, these nobles, and what held them together was why one noble isn't going to decide, hey, I'm going to become a tyrant, is because of this honor that they all shared. And then democracies would only work, he said, in a small place where people had a common interest. And what prevented a democracy from devolving into an aristocracy is virtue, civic virtue. Okay, so this is and he also introduces a really important idea about dividing power or separating power. Montesquieu, he's writing in France. He doesn't really like the French government, but if you're writing in France, you can't say, I really don't like the French government, because you're going to wind up in jail. It's illegal to say that. So what he does is say he's arguing for what's the best model of government. And he says you need a balance and you need a separation of governing powers. And he sees the British government as really a model, because you have the executive, the king, who represents tyrannical force. Then you have the House of Lords that represents the aristocracy. And then you have the House of Commons representing democracy. And these three orders check each other. And because you've separated out their functions, you prevent the tyranny from becoming too tyrannical, or the aristocracy from devolving into tyranny, or the democracy, the House of Commons, from devolving into aristocracy. So he sees this as working in the British government. Now, one of the problems we have with Montesquieu, or I have with Montesquieu, I don't know, is that it's not really the way the British government works. It works because there is a blending of functions. Remember, the real chief executive officer is the prime minister, who's a member of parliament. So there is a blending of functions there. But one place where you do have a separation of powers is in the American colonies. Here, the governor represents the crown, the towns represent the towns, okay? And there's going to be real conflict over the 18th century between these two. And so you do have a real separation of powers here. By the same token, a lot of the writing of English Whigs in the earlier part of the century is about how to constrain executive power. And that's not something that's a mainstream idea in England. That's kind of on the lunatic fringe of the political spectrum there. But here in America, it very much describes what's happening in the political system, constraints on executive power and on arbitrary power. Because remember, the king represents a different interest. The governor represents a different interest. One quick way of remembering this is New York in the early 1700s had a governor, Edward Hyde, Lord Cornbury, and there is a painting in the New York Historical Society of Edward Hyde, Lord Cornbury, in a dress. It's a picture of a rather stout middle-aged woman, and the story was because Lord Cornbury represented his cousin Queen Anne, he appeared at functions in New York wearing this gown. And it's an easy way to remember. The governor represents the monarch, and in this case, Edward Hyde, Lord Cornbury, represented the monarch, Her Majesty Queen Anne. Now, there's a problem. A prominent historian in New York retired and had time on her hands and decided to look into the story of Lord Cornbury. And it turns out Lord Cornbury actually never did appear in a gown at any functions, which then raises two questions. One, how come people started saying that he did? And B, who's this woman in the portrait? I'm not showing you the portrait now because I really could be one of your great, 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 great grandmothers. And I'm saying this is Edward Hyde, Lord Cornbury in a gown, and it turns out not to be. It's anyway, that's one of the things to remember here. And I think that's all the time we have today. We'll come back on Wednesday and we will talk more about these things, and we will also talk about David Hume and Montesquieu and how they fit into this great scheme of things. Okay, so I'll see you all on Wednesday.
Thank you, Professor.
Take care.
Professor.
Thank you.
Have a good
You too.
Thank you.
Take care.